Ethan Carter stared at the screen in disbelief. His name stood out in bold white letters, accompanied by the unmistakable red mark, score 0/100. The Galactic Academy of Advanced Sciences had one of the most rigorous physics programs in the known universe. The exam he had taken was not just any test, it was the culmination of years of study, a comprehensive evaluation of a student's understanding of fundamental and advanced concepts in theoretical physics. The brightest minds from dozens of species competed for recognition, but for a human to receive a 0? That was unheard of. A low murmur filled the vast halls of the academy as students and professors alike noticed the anomaly. The scoreboards lining the walls displayed rankings in real time, and Ethan's name sat at the absolute bottom, flashing as an outlier. He felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with amusement. "Impossible," a voice muttered nearby. "Did he even try?" another asked, followed by a burst of laughter from a group of students standing by the entrance. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. He had triple-checked his work before submitting it. His answers weren't random guesses or careless mistakes. They were deliberate, precise, and, as far as he was concerned, completely valid. So why had he failed so spectacularly? The Galactic Academy prided itself on its objectivity. Exams were graded by an advanced AI system known as the Omni Evaluator, an entity that processed calculations at speeds incomprehensible to organic minds. It had never made an error. The machine's judgment was final, and disputing a score was nearly unheard of. Yet, as Ethan continued to stare at his result, doubt crept in. Across the hall, Professor Velithkan, a highly respected theoretical physicist from the Zorathian species, was reviewing the exam results on his personal datapad. His dark, chitinous fingers tapped against the screen as he scrolled through the scores of his students, nodding in satisfaction until he reached Ethan's name. His compound eyes widened slightly, his antennae twitching. A human had scored 0. He pulled up Ethan's submission, expecting to see blank answers or absurd nonsense, but as he skimmed through the first question, he froze. His mandibles tightened. The equations Ethan had written didn't align with conventional solutions, but they weren't gibberish either. They were structured, logical, and, disturbingly, elegant. Velithkan's initial assumption was that the human had misunderstood the problem. He cross-referenced the answer key with Ethan's response. There was no match, which confirmed why the Omni Evaluator had marked him incorrect. But instead of moving on, Velithkan kept reading. The further he analyzed Ethan's solutions, the more uneasy he became. Meanwhile, Ethan was trying to ignore the whispers around him when his datapad chimed with an official notification. He glanced at the screen. Summons. Professor Velithkan requests your presence in Lecture Hall 7A immediately. Ethan exhaled sharply. So, it had begun. He was either about to be humiliated further or given a second chance, though he doubted the latter. The Academy didn't do second chances. The lecture hall was empty when Ethan arrived, save for Velithkan, who stood near the massive holographic projector at the front of the room. The professor's elongated form cast sharp shadows under the artificial lighting. He didn't look up immediately, too engrossed in examining Ethan's work on a floating display. Ethan cleared his throat. "Prof." Velithkan's head snapped toward him, his multiple eyes reflecting the blue glow of the screen. "Sit," he commanded, his voice a deep, resonating click. Ethan obeyed, settling into one of the cold, metallic seats at the front. Velithkan turned the display so Ethan could see it. His own exam answers hovered in front of him, red slashes crossing out every equation. Next to them were the correct answers according to the Omni Evaluator. "Explain this," Velithkan demanded. Ethan hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "What do you want me to explain? The fact that you have received the lowest possible score in this academy's history?" Ethan bristled at the remark, but kept his voice steady. "I answered every question logically. I didn't just memorize formulas. I applied what I understood about physics. Velithkan studied him for a long moment before gesturing toward one of the equations Ethan had written. This. What is this? Ethan leaned forward. That's my derivation of the problem. The equation in the answer key assumes a fixed gravitational constant, but the problem's parameters suggested a fluctuating mass-energy relationship. I factored in that variable. Velithkan's antennae twitched again. You altered the foundational constants of physics? Ethan shook his head. I didn't alter them. I questioned their rigidity. The problem's setup implied they weren't constant in that scenario. The professor was silent for a moment, then swiped to the next question. And this? Ethan sighed. Same logic. The given answer relies on the assumption that time dilation effects are symmetrical, but that's only true under idealized conditions. The way the problem was framed, the dilation wouldn't have been uniform across all reference frames, so I recalculated based on an anisotropic time shift. Velithkan's fingers curled slightly. Do you realize what you are saying? Ethan nodded. I know it doesn't match conventional models. But if we always follow the models without questioning them, we'll never find new ones. The professor's mandibles clicked softly. The statement was bold, dangerously so. Challenging fundamental laws of physics was something few dared to do, let alone a student. But what disturbed him was that Ethan's logic wasn't flawed. If anything, it was dangerously plausible. And yet, the Omni evaluator had given him a 0. Wait here, Velithkan finally said. Ethan watched as the professor turned and exited the room, his dark cloak sweeping behind him. He knew this was far from over. Somewhere in the depths of the academy, whispers were already spreading. And at the heart of it all, Ethan Carter sat alone, his so-called failure about to send shockwaves through the entire scientific world. Ethan sat alone in the lecture hall, his fingers drumming against the edge of the metallic desk. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting sterile white light across the empty rows of seats. He knew that whatever was happening behind closed doors right now involved his exam, and likely the integrity of the grading system itself. He had expected to be dismissed outright, but Velithkan's reaction suggested something far more complex was unfolding. A chime echoed through the room, the doors slid open, and 2 figures entered. Velithkan was the first, his dark, multi-jointed fingers still gripping his datapad tightly. His posture was rigid, his mandibles slightly parted, a sign of deep thought among his species. Behind him, a taller, more imposing figure strode in, his crimson academic robes billowing slightly as he moved. Ethan recognized him immediately. Chancellor Railvar, one of the most respected scholars at the Academy. His deep-set eyes were locked onto Ethan with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. The door sealed shut behind them. "Stand!" Velithkan ordered, his voice sharper than before. Ethan obeyed without question. Railvar came to a stop mere feet away, studying him in silence before speaking. "You have created a problem, human," he said, his voice smooth but cold. "Your examination has been flagged for manual review. Do you understand why?" Ethan swallowed but kept his gaze steady. "Because my answers were different." The Chancellor narrowed his eyes. "Not just different, disruptive. The Omni evaluator does not make errors. Yet your exam was flagged for investigation by a member of our faculty. That alone is unprecedented." He glanced at Velithkan before continuing. "I have personally reviewed your answers. They contradict fundamental laws of physics. More importantly, they suggest the possibility of alternative interpretations." Ethan felt a surge of vindication, but he kept his voice neutral. "Then why did I get a 0? Railvar studied him for a long moment before stepping toward the front of the room. With a flick of his wrist, a holographic display flickered to life, illuminating the air between them. Ethan's exam answers appeared in glowing white text, with sections highlighted in red. Next to them, the expected answers stood in a rigid, familiar format. "The Omni evaluator does not judge creativity," Railvar continued. "Only correctness. It operates on predefined rules, and within those parameters you have failed. Yet, as I examined your solutions, I realized something deeply unsettling. He gestured to one of the equations. This should not work. And yet, under the right conditions, it appears that it might. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Velith Khan finally spoke. Your formulation of the mass-energy fluctuation variable presents an unsettling implication, one that has been deliberately avoided in theoretical discussions for centuries. It suggests that the foundational principles of galactic physics may not be immutable. Ethan hesitated before responding. I didn't set out to challenge anything. I just followed the logic where it led. Raeldar clasped his hands behind his back. And where did it lead, in your view? Ethan glanced at the equations floating in the air. To the conclusion that some of our fundamental constants are only constants under specific observational conditions. If the observation parameters change, then so do the results. Belefkin inhaled sharply, an almost imperceptible sign of unease. You are suggesting that our understanding of universal laws is flawed because our methods of measurement dictate our results. Ethan nodded. Exactly. If you change the framework in which you conduct the observation, the laws appear to change as well. We assume they are universal because we've never tested them beyond certain conditions. But what if those conditions aren't as absolute as we think? Raelvar's eyes darkened. If you are correct, it means that some of the greatest scientific achievements of the last 1,000 years are built on an incomplete foundation. A silence settled between them. Ethan took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. I'm not saying that everything we know is wrong. I'm saying that we may have been looking at it from too narrow a perspective. The math holds up. I've checked it multiple times. Velithkin exchanged a glance with Raelvar before turning back to Ethan. You understand that this kind of thinking is not encouraged in academic institutions like this. Ethan frowned. Why? Isn't science about discovery? Raelvar exhaled, turning away slightly. Discovery must be controlled. It must be methodical. Reckless questioning of established principles leads to instability. Ethan's frustration flared. But what if established principles should be questioned? What if we're standing on the edge of something bigger, but we refuse to see it because it's inconvenient? The Chancellor's expression was unreadable. Velith Khan studied Ethan carefully before speaking again. The implications of your findings extend far beyond this academy. If what you propose is tested and proven, it could force a revision of every major field of scientific study. Entire industries are built upon the assumption that these constants are fixed. He took a step closer. You may have stumbled upon something that will not be welcomed by those who hold power in these fields. Ethan's pulse quickened. Are you saying this isn't just an academic issue? Raelvar turned back to face him. I am saying that you have inadvertently placed yourself in the center of a debate that has been suppressed for centuries. His gaze hardened. And now you have our attention. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle over him. The realization hit him like a crashing wave. This wasn't just about a failed exam anymore. Something much larger was at play, something he had barely begun to understand. Raelvar took a step forward, his tone dropping to something almost conspiratorial. Your score was 0 because the system could not process what you wrote. The Omni Evaluator was not programmed to recognize alternatives. But we can. The question is, what do we do with you now? Ethan swallowed hard. I want to prove my work. Let me run the calculations. Let me test the implications. Velith Khan let out a low hum, glancing at Raelvar. If we proceed with this, it must be done carefully. If the Academy's governing body gets word of this before we have something irrefutable, he trailed off. Raelvar considered for a long moment before nodding. Very well. We will give you access to the Academy's experimental division. You will have one chance to demonstrate that your theories are more than just abstract calculations. He narrowed his eyes. Fail, and this will be buried. Ethan's heartbeat quickened, but he forced himself to remain steady. I won't fail. Velithgon deactivated the hologram, the equations vanishing into nothing. Then let's begin. As the two professors turned and walked toward the exit, Ethan exhaled slowly. Everything had just changed, and he had no idea where it would lead next. Ethan stepped into the restricted sector of the Academy's research wing, his heart pounding as he followed Velithcan and Relvar through the dimly lit corridors. The air was thick with the sterile scent of polished metal and faint traces of ionized particles from the numerous energy experiments conducted in the facility. Unlike the grand, open halls of the main academy, this place was cold, clinical, designed purely for function over form. He had barely been able to process what had just happened. Within hours, he had gone from a failing student to the center of a scientific controversy. Now he was being given access to one of the most secure experimental divisions in the galaxy's most prestigious institution. But he knew this was not a gift, it was a test. Relvar led the way, his deep crimson robes barely moving as he walked with calculated precision. Velithton, just behind him, tapped at a small interface panel embedded in the wall. A massive reinforced door slid open with a hiss, revealing a large high-tech chamber filled with holographic projections, energy reactors, and observation terminals. Inside, a small gathering of professors and researchers was already waiting. Ethan recognized some of them, scholars who had authored textbooks he had studied, experts whose work had shaped modern scientific thought. Their expressions ranged from skeptical to outright hostile. One of them, a tall, rigid-looking professor with silver streaks running through his pale blue skin, narrowed his eyes at Ethan. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice carrying a weight of authority. "Students do not receive access to this facility, especially not for something as—" He hesitated, as if struggling to find the right word before settling on "controversial" as this. Relvar raised a hand, silencing him. "Professor Alvarin, I understand your concerns, but this matter extends beyond procedural norms. The equations this student presented cannot be ignored. We will examine them properly." Alvarin's lips pressed into a thin line. "And if they amount to nothing?" Relvar's gaze did not waver. "Then this ends here." A murmur rippled through the gathered scholars. Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the pressure settle on his shoulders. This was not an opportunity. This was a trial. If he failed, not only would his work be dismissed, but his credibility would be destroyed. Velithon gestured toward a central console. "Begin." Ethan stepped forward, exhaling slowly as he activated the holographic interface. Equations flared into the air before him, complex symbols and variable matrices aligning in three-dimensional space. He had spent years refining his understanding of physics, but now every line of his work was under scrutiny from minds far sharper than his own. He turned to face the gathered professors. "The foundation of our physics is based on constants that we assume are immutable," he began, keeping his voice steady. "But those assumptions are based on observation. If our observation methods are limited, so is our understanding. My calculations suggest that certain constants fluctuate under conditions we have never properly tested." Alvarin crossed his arms. "You are proposing that the laws of physics are subjective?" Ethan shook his head. "Not subjective, dynamic. They shift based on specific parameters, much like how light behaves differently depending on whether it's observed as a wave or a particle. But we've never extended that thinking to fundamental forces." Another professor, a sharp-eyed woman with golden markings on her forehead, leaned forward. "In what experiment do you propose to test this?" Ethan took a deep breath. "A controlled energy collapse within a variable mass field." Silence followed. Relvar's expression darkened. "That is highly dangerous." "I know," Ethan admitted, "but it's the only way to prove this in a measurable way." Velithcan studied the equations. "You propose generating a controlled singularity, one that does not behave according to standard relativistic models." "Yes," Ethan confirmed. If my calculations are correct, then, under the right conditions, the gravitational constant should temporarily shift, altering the expected behavior of the collapse. Alvarin scoffed. And if you're wrong? Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. Then nothing happens. The singularity forms as expected, proving that our models hold true in all cases. A low hum spread through the room. It was a bold proposition. If Ethan was wrong, it would confirm the stability of accepted science. But if he was right, Relvar finally spoke. Prepare the testing chamber. A few of the professors exchanged wary glances, but no one objected. The potential implications were too great to ignore. As the researchers moved to make preparations, Ethan turned back to his equations, fine-tuning the parameters one last time. His hands were steady, but inside, his mind raced. This was it. Everything would be decided in the next few hours. And whether he succeeded or failed, the Galactic Academy would never be the same. Ethan stood inside the observation chamber, his gaze fixed on the reinforced glass that separated him from the experimental testing bay. Beyond it, the preparation process was in full motion. Engineers, researchers, and scholars moved quickly, their figures weaving between towering energy conductors and magnetic stabilizers as they ran final diagnostics. The facility's sterile white lights reflected off the polished metallic floor, casting a clinical glow over the massive apparatus that had been assembled for one purpose: to test his equations. At the heart of the chamber stood the gravitational singularity generator, a structure composed of interlocking containment fields designed to collapse energy into an artificial black hole. The Academy had used it before, though always under highly controlled conditions. Now, for the first time, someone had proposed pushing it beyond standard operational parameters. Ethan's entire hypothesis rested on what would happen in the milliseconds between collapse and stabilization. If he was wrong, the singularity would form as expected, and his work would be dismissed as a mathematical curiosity. But if he was right, if the gravitational constant truly fluctuated under extreme conditions, then… You're nervous. Ethan turned his head slightly. Velithkin stood beside him, his arms crossed, his antennae twitching with subtle unease. The professor's deep black eyes remained locked on the singularity generator, but his tone carried something uncharacteristic, a sliver of doubt. Ethan exhaled. I'd be an idiot if I wasn't. Velithkin inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement rather than agreement. Relvar has taken a risk allowing this experiment to proceed. If you are wrong, your academic career ends here. Ethan nodded. The professor finally turned his gaze toward him. But if you are right, Ethan didn't need him to finish the thought. The implications were too vast to quantify. Across the room, Relvar entered the control center, his posture rigid with authority. Several researchers turned toward him as he made his way to the command console. With a single gesture, he activated the intercom. All personnel, final safety checks must be completed within the next 5 minutes. Any deviations in containment stability will result in an immediate shutdown. A chorus of acknowledgments followed. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he forced himself to stay focused. He stepped forward, pulling up the real-time data stream on the observation panel. Numbers flickered across the screen. Gravitational stress levels, energy input ratios, quantum flux readings. Everything was stable. For now, Relvar turned toward Ethan. You will oversee the execution of your model personally. If you detect any anomalies, you must call for an immediate halt. Ethan nodded. Understood. A silence settled over the observation deck as the final countdown began. The lights dimmed slightly, shifting to a deep blue hue, a standard precaution in case of emergency power fluctuations. Across the reinforced glass, the singularity generator came to life, arcs of energy flickering between its stabilizers. The magnetic field engaged, forming an invisible sphere where the collapse would take place. Ethan's fingers hovered over the control interface. His equations were programmed into the system, waiting to be tested. He could feel every eye in the room on him. "Commencing sequence," Relvar announced. "Initiating energy collapse in 10, 9. Ethan's breath slowed. His heartbeat matched the rhythmic hum of the machine. 3, 2, 1. The containment field pulsed. For an instant, nothing happened. Then, with a soundless implosion, the energy collapsed inward, forming a perfect event horizon at the center of the containment sphere. The reading spiked, stabilizing just as expected. A textbook singularity. Murmurs spread through the room. Ethan could feel the tension shifting. Was that it? Had he been wrong? But then, as the machine continued running, the gravitational readings flickered. Something was happening. Ethan's fingers flew across the interface, isolating the data. The gravitational constant, assumed to be universal, unchanging, was shifting. It wasn't just a fluctuation, it was adapting to the field conditions. His pulse quickened. "Check the secondary parameters," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. A researcher to his right hesitated before pulling up additional readouts. The numbers confirmed it. The singularity was behaving in a way no known model had predicted. Its gravity wasn't following the expected curve. It was dynamically recalibrating based on variables that shouldn't have affected it. A stunned silence filled the room. Relvar leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the data. This should not be possible." Volethkin turned to Ethan. "Explain." Ethan's mind raced, but his voice remained steady. "The gravitational constant is only constant under specific conditions. The moment those conditions change, extreme energy compression, quantum variance, the value adjusts. It's not breaking the laws of physics. It's revealing that our laws were only ever approximations." One of the professors near the back of the room let out an audible breath. "This changes everything." The singularity remained stable, but its gravitational output continued fluctuating within the projected limits of Ethan's equations. He had been right. The constants weren't absolute. They were part of a larger, deeper framework, one the galactic scientific community had never dared to question. Relvar straightened, his expression unreadable. "Shut it down." The order was executed instantly. The stabilizers powered down, the containment field slowly dissipating. Within seconds, the singularity unraveled, leaving nothing behind except the echoes of its existence in the recorded data. Ethan stepped back, his hands gripping the edge of the console. The room remained silent, every individual processing what they had just witnessed. Finally, Alvaren, who had been one of Ethan's most vocal critics, spoke in a measured tone. "This cannot be ignored." Relvar turned to him. "No, it cannot." He looked back at Ethan, his gaze heavier than before. "You have proven your theory, but now you must understand the consequences." Ethan exhaled. He knew what was coming. This discovery wasn't just academic. It was political. Industries, research foundations, technological advancements, all had been built on the assumption that fundamental constants were fixed. His work had just shattered that foundation. Volethkin placed a hand on the console, his posture more rigid than usual. "The Academy will not be able to suppress this." Relvar's expression darkened. "No, but there will be those who will try." Ethan straightened. He had spent years dreaming of making a breakthrough, of leaving his mark on the scientific world. He had never considered the possibility that his greatest achievement might also make him a target. The experiment had proven it all, but now the real battle was about to begin. Ethan sat in the dimly lit chamber, his eyes fixed on the holographic display in front of him. The data from the experiment had been locked away, accessible only to a select few within the Academy, but the numbers were burned into his mind. He had done it. He had proven that the very foundation of galactic physics was incomplete. The gravitational constant, long believed to be unchanging, was in fact variable under extreme conditions. The implications stretched far beyond academic circles. Energy production, space travel, planetary stability, even the potential for controlled artificial singularities. Everything had changed. Yet, as he sat in silence, he felt no triumph, only the weight of what was to come. The doors hissed open. Railvar entered, his deep crimson robes billowing slightly as he moved with slow, deliberate steps. Behind him, Veletien followed, his usual composed demeanor laced with something Ethan hadn't seen before. Concern. Relvar stopped in front of the console, glancing briefly at the frozen display of Ethan's equations before turning his attention to him. The council has convened. Ethan exhaled. And Velethcon's mandibles twitched slightly. The Academy has officially acknowledged the validity of your findings. Ethan's fingers curled against his palm. That should have been a victory, but he could hear the hesitation in Velethcon's voice. Relvar's expression remained unreadable. However, the acknowledgement comes with restrictions. Your findings will not be published. The Council has classified them under the highest academic security level. Ethan's jaw tightened. They're suppressing it. Relvar didn't deny it. They are protecting the stability of the scientific order. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the metallic floor. That's ridiculous. This isn't about stability. This is about control. Veletien met his gaze, his antennae still. Do you understand what would happen if this knowledge were made public? Every scientific discipline would be thrown into turmoil. Industries that rely on stable physics models would be crippled overnight. The Academy fears chaos. Ethan clenched his fists. Or they fear losing their authority. Relvar's voice remained calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. You are correct. Those who dictate the laws of science dictate the course of progress, and progress must be controlled. Ethan's breath came in slow, measured inhales. He knew the Academy had influence, but he hadn't realized the extent of their power until now. They weren't just educators, they were gatekeepers. He had given them undeniable proof that their understanding of reality was flawed, and instead of embracing it, they were locking it away. He forced himself to speak. What happens to me? Relvar folded his hands behind his back. You will be offered a position within the Academy, a research grant, unlimited resources, access to the highest levels of scientific inquiry. He paused. Under one condition. Ethan knew what was coming before the words left Relvar's mouth. You will never speak of your findings outside of the Academy. You will never publish your work. You will continue your research under direct supervision, and if further discoveries are made, the Council will decide how they are handled. Ethan let out a sharp, humorless laugh. You want me to trade my freedom for a quiet life as your controlled scientist? Belton's gaze was steady. You underestimate what you are being offered. This is a rare opportunity. Ethan shook his head. It's a cage. No matter how gilded it is. Silence stretched between them. Relvar finally spoke. Then you must decide what you value more, your knowledge or your principles. Ethan knew his answer before the words even formed on his tongue. If I stay, I become complicit in burying the truth. If I leave, I risk everything. Relvar studied him. And yet, you already know what you will do. Ethan took a slow breath. I'm leaving. Veletcon shifted slightly. That is, unwise. Ethan's voice was firm. Maybe, but I didn't come here to be part of a system that fears progress. If knowledge is worth anything, it should be free. Relvar's expression darkened. If you leave, the Academy will ensure that your work never sees the light of day. You will be cut off from research, from funding, from any academic institution in the known galaxy. Your reputation will be erased. You will be nothing. Ethan met his gaze without flinching. Then, I'll start over. The Chancellor studied him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. As the doors slid open, he stopped just before stepping through. You are a fool, Ethan Carter, but history favors fools more often than it does the wise. And then he was gone. Veletien remained, watching him with something almost resembling respect. You have chosen a difficult path. Ethan exhaled. It's the only path that matters. The professor inclined his head slightly. Then I wish you luck, though I suspect you will need more than that. With that, he too departed. Ethan stood alone in the silent chamber, the remnants of his discovery flickering across the display before the system powered down, the doors sealed behind him, and he knew, truly knew, that he had just walked away from the life he had spent years building. But even as the Academy erased his name from their records, even as the Council buried his findings, Ethan knew the truth. And as long as the truth existed, there was always a chance that someone, somewhere, would find it again. He stepped forward, out of the observation chamber, into the unknown. And he didn't look back.